The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings, and of civilization in the Near East, from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Will Durant. Chapter 8, The Gods of Greece. And of course, I'm reading the book, so I'm not saying that anything in particular is actually a god. That's just what they're calling it. And I'm leaving some openness to say what they mean by the term god, or what you might mean. Section 2, an inventory of the gods. Part 1, the lesser deities. We shall force some order and clarity upon this swarm of gods if we artificially divide them into 7 groups: sky gods, earth gods, fertility gods, animal gods, subterranean gods, ancestor or hero gods, and Olympians. The names of all of them, as Hesiod said, it were troublesome for a mortal man to tell. Now, if it's important, it's worth going through the effort. And the language means something. It implies something. And the context outside of names and language gives you some things that if you think about it and use it, you'll figure it out or experience it. 1. Originally, so far as we can make out, the Greek god of the invading Greeks, as of the Vedic Hindus, was the noble and various sky itself. It was probably this sky god who, with progressing anthropomorphism, became Uranus, our heaven, and then the cloud-compelling, rain-making, thunder-hurting Zeus, and a land surfeited with sunshine and hungry for rain. The sun, Helios, was only a minor deity. Agamemnon prayed to him, and the Spartans sacrificed horses to him and drew his flaming chariot through the skies. Now let's remember, the Hindus also made offerings of horses. Phaethon, the brilliant, son of Helios, begged for the thrill of driving the sun's chariot across the heavens. He drove it recklessly, nearly set the world on fire, was struck by lightning and fell into the sea. Perhaps the Greeks meant this tale, like that of Icarus, to serve as a sermon to the youth. The Rhodians, in Hellenistic days, honored Helios as their chief divinity, flung annually into the sea 4 horses and a chariot for his use, and dedicated to him the famous Colossus. And Anaxagoras almost lost his life, even in Periclean Athens, for saying that the sun was not a god, but only a ball of fire. Generally, however, there was little worship of the sun in classic Greece, still less of the moon. Selene, least of all of the planets, are the stars. Well, there can be a difference between the entity of something and the thing itself. And of course, ultimate divinity is divinity over these various things too. 2. The earth, not the heavens, was the home of most Greek gods. And first, the earth itself was the goddess Ga, or Gaia, patient and bountiful mother, pregnant through the embrace of reigning Uranus, the sky. 1,000 lesser deities dwelt on the earth, in its waters, or in its surrounding air, spirits of sacred trees, especially the oak, Nereids, Naiads, Okeanids, in rivers, lakes, or the sea. Gods gushing forth as wells or springs, or flowing as stately streams like the Ma'ander, or the Sperchus, gods of the wind like Boreas, Zephyr, Natus, and Eurus. So is that north, east, south, and west wind? With their master, Aulus, are the great god Pan, the horned, cloven-footed, sensual, smiling nourisher, god of shepherds and flocks, of woods and the wild life lurking in them, he whose magic flute could be heard in every brook and dell, whose startling cry brought panic to any careless herd, and whose attendants were merry fawns and satyrs, called Sileni, half goat and half Socrates. Everywhere in nature there were gods. The air was so crowded with spirits of good or evil that, said an unknown poet, there is not one empty chink into which you could push the spike of a blade of corn. And, they mean grain. They don't mean, that stuff that mostly is fed to pigs. 3. The most mysterious and potent force in nature, being reproduction. It was natural that the Greeks, like other ancient peoples, should worship the principle and emblems of fertility in man and woman, along with their worship of fertility in the soil. The phallus, as symbol of reproduction, appears in the rites of Demeter, Dionysus, Hermes, even of the chase, Artemis. In classical sculpture and painting, this emblem recurs with scandalous frequency. Even the great Dionysia, the religious festival at which the Greek drama was played, was introduced by the phallic processions, to which Athenian colonies piously sent phalli. Doubtless such festivals lent themselves to much lusty humor, as one may judge from Aristophanes, but in all, the humor was healthy and perhaps served with the purpose of stimulating eros and promoting the birth rate. Well, if people are, too focused on the public desire, it actually kind of spends some of the energy that they would have spent at home, so there actually is less sex in the society when that's too much of the focus. But I understand why people might think that that's not the case. The more vulgar side of this fertility cult was expressed in the Hellenistic and Roman periods by the worship of Priapus, born of an amour between Dionysus and Aphrodite. There's also a medical condition that they bring up in regards to that. And popular with vase painters and the mural artists of Pompeii, a lovelier variation of the reproductive theme was the veneration of the goddesses representing motherhood. Arcadia, Argos, Eleusis, Athens, Ephesus, and other such localities gave their greatest devotion to feminine deities, often husbandless, as goddesses presumably reflect a primitive matrilineal age before the coming of marriage. The enthronement of Zeus as father god over all gods represents the victory of the patriarchal principle. Note the absence of the mother goddesses in strongly patriarchal societies such as Judea, Islam, and Protestant Christendom. Well, Islam doesn't have a father deity either, and much of Judaism and Zoroastrianism doesn't have a male deity. They speak of gods beyond that. But patriarchal is how primates are. People talk about matrilineal societies, and it's like, that doesn't mean it's not patriarchal. In Islam, for example, women vote. And women vote, they hit puberty younger, so they have their full rights at a younger age than the males do. But people generally disregard that when they're going to be all modern. The probable priority of women in agriculture may have helped them to give them form to the greatest of these mother deities, Demeter, goddess of the grain, or tilled earth, one of the most beautiful of the Greek myths, skillfully narrated in the hymn to Demeter, once attributed to Homer, tells how Demeter's daughter Persephone, while gathering flowers, was kidnapped by Pluto, god of the underworld, and snatched down to Hades. The sorrowing mother searched for her everywhere, found her, and persuaded Pluto to let Persephone live on the earth 9 months in every year, a pretty symbol for the annual death and rebirth of the soil, because the people of Eleusis befriended the disguised Demeter as she sat by the way, grieved in her inmost heart. She taught them and Attica the secret of agriculture, and sent to Ptolemy, son of Eleusis' king, to spread the art among mankind. Essentially, it was the same myth as that of Isis and Osiris in Egypt. Is that Yes and Yesir? That's how they would say it. Tammuz and Ishtar in Babylonia. Astarte and Adonis in Syria. Cabela and Attis in Phrygia. The cult of motherhood survived through the classic times to take new life in the worship of Mary, the Mother of God. And I do intend at some point to go over James George Frazier's The Golden Bough on this channel and comment my way through that. Now, the different terms of the climate would dictate some of these myths and the calendar cycle and stuff too. Like, for example, under Zarathustra, there could be frost for 10, or snow for 10 months of the year. Now, it might melt during the day, during summer or something, but, you know, it was a possibility. And certain Tibetan myths and stuff reflect that sort of same idea too. It's just 10 months of the year, you know, the cold was a risk. 4. Certain animals in ancient Greece were honored as semi-deities. Greek religion was too anthropomorphic in its sculptural age to admit the divine menageries that we find in Egypt and India. There's an oracle deck of menageries. I think they bounced the idea off of this. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the book or the deck in full. That we find in Egypt and India, but a vestige of a less classical past seems to appear in the frequent association of an animal with a god. Well, all throughout Africa and Europe and Asia and stuff, we have this idea. The bull was sacred because of its strength and potency. It was often an associate, disguise, or symbol of Zeus and Dionysus, and perhaps preceded them as a god. In like manner, the cow-eyed Hera may once have been a sacred cow. The pig, too, was holy because of its fertility. It was associated with the gentle Demeter at one of her festivals, the Thesmophoria. The sacrifice was ostensibly of a pig, possibly to it. At the feast of the Diasia, the sacrifice was nominally to Zeus, really to a subterranean snake that was now dignified with his name. Well, sometimes over time, some of these ideas are divided into separate deities. Whether the snake was holy as supposedly deathless, or as a symbol of the reproductive power, we find it passing down as a deity from the snake goddess of Crete into a 5th century Athens in the temple of Athena. On the Acropolis, a sacred serpent dwelt to whom each month a holy cake was offered in appeasing sacrifice. In Greek art, a snake is often seen about the figures of Hermes, Apollo, and Asclepius. Under the shield of Phidias, Athena, Parthenos, was wreathed a mighty serpent. The Farnese, Athena, is half covered with snakes. The snake was often used as a symbol or form of the guardian deity of the temple or home, perhaps because it prowled about the tombs. It was believed to be the soul of the dead. The Pathian Games are thought to have been celebrated at first in honor of the dead Pathon of Delphi. Well, snakes were seldom treated as a demonic symbol, even though if you look like in ancient Egypt, snakes and fire were shown to be associated with what typically in our translations are gods. Well, they're talking about jinn, of course. But there's a lot of symbolism in snakes, too. It's not always... Sometimes it's just their form, but let's not moralize the differences between one sort of creature and the next. I don't know if there's something wrong with that turtle, because I don't know how long she was caught on the fence. Because she may have... Well, once it rains, maybe those marks on her will go away. 5. The most terrible of gods were under the earth, in caves and clefts, and like nether chambers, dwelt those Chthonian, or earthly deities, whom the Greeks worshipped, not by day with loving adoration, but at night with apopropaic rites of riddance and fear. These vague, non-human powers were the real autochthonoi of Greece, older than the Hellas, older perhaps than the Macedoниans, who probably transmitted them to Greece. If we could trace them to their origin, we might find that they were the vengeful spirits of the animals that had been driven into the forests or under the soil by the advance and multiplication of men. The greatest of these subterranean deities was called Zeus, Chthonius, but Zeus here meant God, or he was called Zeus Malikios, the benevolent god, but here again the words were deceptive and propitiatory, for this god was a fearful snake. Brother to Zeus was Hades, lord of the underworld, that took his name to placate him. The Greeks called him Plato, the giver of abundance. I don't know if Pluto is really how you pronounce it, because the lettering indicates that that's probably not. For he had it still in his power to bless or blight the roots of all things that grew in the soil. Platus, god of wealth, was a form of Plata. In early Greece, wealth took chiefly the form of grain, either growing in the earth or stored in the earthen jars, in either case under Plata's protection. Still more ghostly and terrible was Hecate, an evil spirit that came up from the lower world and brought misfortune through her evil eye to all whom she visited. The less learned Greeks sacrificed puppies to keep her away. And sometimes Hecate was thought of as one entity, or perhaps as a name of divinity. It wasn't even necessarily thought of in terms of one gender. So the making all the gods one and all that sort of stuff, that sort of already happened, or maybe they were made into separate conceptions, or people came along with the realization and they just applied that sort of thing. But, don't look at one myth and one gender and aspect of these stories and act like this was the only possible thing going on in that culture, because across the board, monotheism and polytheism were pretty much standard things in history. 6. Before the classical age, the dead were regarded as spirits capable of good and evil to men, and were appeased with offerings and prayer. And they were not quite gods, but the primitive Greek family, like the Chinese, honored its dead beyond any deity. In classical Greece, these vague ghosts were more dreaded than loved, and were propitiated with aversion rituals. And in the festival of Anthesteria, the worship of heroes was an extension of the cult of the dead. Great, noble, or beautiful men or women could be raised by the gods to immortal life and become minor deities. So the people of Olympia offered annual sacrifice to Hippodamia. Cassandra was worshipped at Laconian Leuctra. Remember, Cassandra became the word for people who would speak with religious authority on anything. Sibyl became the word for a person who would oracle read in a certain sense that people typically think of it. Helen at Sparta, Oedipus at Colonus, are something considered to be a god, might descend into the body of a mortal and transform him with divinity, or the entity might cohabit with the mortal and beget a hero god, as Zeus with Alcmena begot Heracles. Many cities, groups, even professions trace their origin to some god-born hero, so the physicians of Greece look back to Asclepius. The god was once a dead man, ancestor, or hero. The temple was originally a tomb. The church is still, in most lands, a shelter for relics of the sacred dead. In general, the Greeks made less distinction between men and gods than we do. Many of their gods were as human, except in birth, as our saints, and as close to their worshippers. And though they were called immortals, some of them, like Dionysus, could die. Well, the jinn are comparatively immortal, and they're comparatively immortal compared to the longest living of humans. No matter what mythology you're looking at, these humans that live hundreds of years longer than any known human to have been verified to have lived. There was that Chinese guy who died this century. I forget what year, and that at 256, and that Nepalese guy who died at 142. And then you have some more people who died in their 130s. And, it goes on. Part 2 of section 2, the Olympians. All these were the less famous, though not necessarily the less honored, gods of Greece. How is it that we hear so little of them in Homer, and so much of the Olympians? Probably because the gods of Olympus entered with the Achaeans and Dorians, overlaid the Macedonian and Chthonian deities, and conquered them as their worshippers were conquered, much like the Marduk cult did. That it's said that Abraham fled from. We see the change in action at Dodona and Delphi, where the older god of the earth, Gaia, was displaced in the one case by Zeus, in the other by Apollo. The defeated gods were not wiped out. They remained, so to speak, as subject deities, hiding bitterly underground, but still revered by the common people, while the victorious Olympians received on their mountaintops the worship of the aristocracy, hence Homer, who composed for the elite, says almost nothing of the nether gods. Homer, Hesiod, and the sculptors helped the political ascendancy of the conquerors to spread the cult of the Olympians. Sometimes the minor gods were combined or absorbed into the greater figures, or became their attendants or satellites, very much as minor states were now and then attached or subjected to greater ones. So the Satyrs and the Sileni were given to Dionysus, so that is it Satyrs? The sea nymphs to Poseidon, the mountain and forest sprites to Artemis. The more savage rites and myths faded out. The chaos of a demon-haunted earth yielded to a semi-orderly divine government that reflected the growing political stability of the Greek world. At the head of the new regime was the majestic and patriarchal Zeus, which, very interesting enough, was given the same position in the general sphere hierarchy as most of what we talk about with Yahweh and Jupiter, of course. He was not the first in time. Uranus and Cronus, as we have seen, preceded him, but they and the Titans, like Lucifer's hosts, were overthrown. Now, there's a lot of confusion about that whole Lucifer thing, because in the Bible, it's not Lucifer that's overthrown, it's Satan. Lucifer is generally the enlightened figure and all that. We go into that elsewhere, but the struggle between Zeus and his aides against the Titans became, for the Greeks, a symbol of the conquest of barbarism and brute strength by civilization and reason, and offered a frequent subject for art. Now, Luciferian brings out that light. So the light, life, and love for the age, it's the Apollonian and the Dionysian all in the same movement of self-realization, self-actualization. It's not an ignorance of other entities out there, deities even. It's not necessarily rebellion. But I understand a Christian writing this as, Lucifer was overthrown or something. Isn't Jesus put forward as the Lucifer figure? Zeus and his brothers cast lots to divide the world among them. Zeus won the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the bowels of the earth. There is no creation in this mythology. The world existed before the gods, and the gods do not make man out of the slime, but beget him by union among themselves or with their mortal offspring. God is literally the Father in the theology of the Greeks. Nar are the Olympians, omnipotent or omniscient. Each limits the other or even opposes the other. Any one of them, especially Zeus, can be deceived. Nevertheless, they acknowledge the suzerainty and crowd his court like the retainers of a feudal lord, and though he consults them on occasion, and now and then yields his preference to theirs, he frequently puts them in their place. He begins as a sky and mountain god, provider of the indispensable rain. Like Yahweh, he is, Al-Shaddai, the strong leader that cast out the goat demon. Among his earlier forms, god of war, he debates with himself whether to end the siege of True or to make the war more bloody, and decides for the latter course. The name Zeus is probably akin to the Latin dies or day, and may come from an Indo-European root di, meaning to shine. Jupiter is Zeu Pater, Zeus the Father, hence the genitive dios, which is closer to referring to transcendence and stuff. Today, the haunts and peaks once sacred to Zeus are named or dedicated to Saint Elias, the rain-giving saint of the Greek Church. Did he pray for rain in the Bible? I don't remember that part of the story. Among his earlier forms, gradually he becomes the calm and mighty ruler of gods and men, bestriding Olympus in bearded dignity. He is the head and source of the mortal order of the world. He punishes filial neglect, guards family property, sanctions oaths, pursues perjurers, and protects boundaries, hearths, suppliants, and guests. At last, he is the serene dispenser of judgment, whom Phidias carves for Olympia. His one failing is the youthful readiness with which he falls in love. I personally wouldn't call the pursuit of sex love necessarily. I mean, people love sex, but, not having created women, he admires them as wonderful beings, bearing even to the gods the inestimable gifts of beauty and tenderness, and he finds it beyond him to resist them. Hesiod draws up a long list of the divine amours and their glorious offspring. His first mate is Dione, but he leaves her in Epirus when he moves to Thessalian Olympus. There his first wife is Metis, goddess of measure, mind, wisdom. Gossip says that her children will dethrone him. Therefore he swallows her, absorbs her qualities, and becomes himself the god of wisdom. Metis is delivered of Athena within him, and his head has to be cut open that Athena may be born. Lonely for loveliness, he takes Themis for his mate, and begets by her the 12 hours. Then he takes Euronome, and begets the 3 graces, then Mnemosyne, and engenders the 9 muses, then Leto, and fathers Apollo and Artemis, and his sister Demeter, and has Persephone. Finally, having sown his wild oats, he weds his sister Hera, makes her queen of Olympus, and receives from her Hepe, Aris, Hephaestus, and Eileithyia. But he does not get along well with Hera. She is as old a god as he, and more honored in many states. She is the patron deity of matrimony and motherhood, protectress of the marriage tie. She is prim and grave and virtuous, and frowns upon his escapades. Moreover, she is an excellent shrew. He thinks of beating her, but finds it easier to console himself with new amours. His first mortal mate is Niobe. His last is Alcmena, who is descended from Niobe in the 16th generation. He loves also with Greek impartiality the handsome Ganymede, and snatches him up to be his cupbearer on Olympus. It was natural that so fertile a father should have distinguished children. When Athena was born in full development and armament from the head of Zeus, she provided the literature of the world with one of its most hackneyed similes. She was an appropriate goddess for Athens, consoling its maids with her proud virginity. Of course, chastity is really the point here. Inspiring its men with martial ardor, because they want a clean woman, and symbolizing for Pericles the wisdom that belonged to her as the daughter of Metis and Zeus. When Pallas and Titan tried to make love to her, she slew him. Yeah, no means no, right? And added his name to hers as a warning to other suitors. To her Athens dedicated its loveliest temple and its most splendid festival. More widely worshipped than Athena was her comely brother Apollo, bright deity of the sun, patron of music, poetry, and art, founder of cities, maker of laws, god of healing, and father of Asclepius, far-darting archer and god of war, successor to Gaia and Phoebe. From the Phoebe, he took the name Phoebus, inspired at Delphi as the holiest oracle of Greece. As god of the growing crops, he received tithe offerings at harvest time, and in return he radiated his golden warmth and light from Delos and Delphi to enrich the soil. Everywhere he was associated with order, measure, and beauty. And whereas in other cults there were strange elements of fear and superstition in the worship of Apollo and his great festivals at Delphi and Delos, the dominant note was the rejoicing of a brilliant people in a god of health and wisdom, reason, and song. And I skipped over a note. I don't know where it is. Okay. Niobe in the 16th generation. Okay. It should be added in Justice to the Dead that these adventures were probably invented by the poets or by tribes anxious to trace the lineage to the greatest of the gods. Well, again, they were combining their history into a sacred history. And the Bible, in doing it, kind of jumbled some of the historical dates and stuff like that itself, too. Happy, too, was his sister Artemis, also known as Diana, maiden goddess of the chase, so absorbed in the ways of animals and the pleasures of the woods that she had no time for the love of men. She was the goddess of wild nature, of meadows, forests, hills, and the sacred bough. As Apollo was the ideal of Greek youth, so Artemis was the model of Greek girlhood, strong, athletic, graceful, chaste, and yet again she was the patroness of women in childbirth who prayed to her to ease their pains. At Ephesus, she kept her Asiatic character as a goddess of motherhood and fertility. In this way, the ideas of virgin and mother became confused in her worship, and the Christian Church found it wise in the 5th century of our era to attach the remnants of this cult to Mary, and to transform the mid-August harvest festival into Artemis, into the feast of the Assumption. In such ways, the old is preserved and the new, and everything changes except the essence. History, like life, must be continuous or die. Character and institutions may be altered, but slowly, a serious interruption of their development throws them into national amnesia and insanity. A thoroughly human figure in this pantheon was the master craftsman of Olympus, that lame Hephaestus, whom the Romans knew as Vulcan. At first he seems a pitiful and ridiculous figure, kind of like Bast in ancient Egypt. No, who's the jokester deity that I put forward as political? This insulted and injured Quasimodo of the skies, but in the end, our sympathies are with him, rather than with the clever and unscrupulous gods who maltreat him. Perhaps in early days, before he became so human, he had been the leaping spirit of the fire and the forge. In the Homeric theogony, he is the son of Zeus and Hera, but other myths assure us that Hera, jealous of Zeus's unaided delivery of Athena, gave birth to Hephaestus without the aid of any male. Seeing him to be ugly and weak, she cast him down from Olympus. He found his way back and built for the gods the many mansions in which they dwelt. Though his mother had dealt so cruelly with him, he showed her all kindness and respect, and defended her so zealously in one of her quarrels with Zeus that the great Olympian seized him by the leg and hurled him down to the earth. A whole day Hephaestus fell. At last he landed on the island of Lemnos and hurt his ankle. Falling for a whole day and only hurting his ankle, that's just quite a... Certainly thereafter, before, says Homer, he was painfully lame. Well, Islam teaches that if you're punished with the least of the punishment of the hellfire, that you're put in a boot that's up to your ankle, and it boils your brain, so he's painfully lame. Again, he found his way back to Olympus. In his resounding workshops, he built a mighty anvil with 20 huge bellows, made the shield and armor of Achilles, statues that moved of their own accord, and other very wonderful things. The Greeks worshipped him as the god of all metal trades, and then of all handicrafts, and pictured the volcanoes as chimneys of his subterranean forges. It was his misfortune that he married Aphrodite, for it is difficult for beauty to be virtuous. Now, good position, bad position, and inequality doesn't necessarily mean that, you can't be virtuous. It was his misfortune that he married Aphrodite. Anyways, learning of her affair with Ares, Hephaestus fashioned a trap that fell upon the lovers as they loved, and then the limping deity had his lame revenge by bringing his fellow gods to look in laughter upon the bound divinities of love and war. But to Hermes, Homer tells us, Apollo said, Hermes, son of Zeus, wouldst thou, in sooth, be willing, even though ensnared with strong hands, to lie on a couch by the side of golden Aphrodite? Then the messenger answered him, would that this might befall, Lord Apollo, that thrice many bonds and execrable might clasp me about, and that ye gods, and all the goddesses too, might be looking on, that I might sleep by the side of golden Aphrodite. Ares, Mars, was never distinguished for intelligence or subtlety. His business was war, and even the charms of Aphrodite could not give him the thrill that came to him from lusty and natural killing. It's important not to kill just because you have the desire to kill either, but, Homer calls him the curse of men, and tells with pleasure how Athena laid him low with a stone. He covered, as he lay, 7 acres of the field. Hermes, Mercury, is more interesting. In origin, he is a stone, and from the cult of the sacred stones, his worship is derived. The stages of his evolution are still visible. Then he is the tall stone placed upon graves, or he is the daimon, or spirit in the stone. Anti-personal self, kind of guide figure. It's not the same thing as a demon. There is a connection in how we get our language term, but, Then he is the boundary stone, or its god, marking and guarding a field, and because his function there is also to promote fertility, the phallus becomes one of his symbols, and then he is the herm or pillar, with a carved head, uncarved body, and prominent male member, which was placed before all respectable houses in Athens. We shall see how the mutilation of these herma on the eve of the expedition against Syracuse provided approximate case for the ruins of Alcibiades in Athens. Again, he is the god of wayfarers and the protector of heralds. Their characteristic staff are Caduceus is one of his favorite insignia. As gods of travelers, he became a god of luck, trade, cunning, and gain, therefore an inventor and guarantor of measures and scales, a patron saint of perjurers, embezzlers, and thieves. He is himself a herald, bearing the billets and decrees of Olympus, from god to god or man, and he moves on winged sandals with the speed of an angry wind. His running about gives him a lithe and graceful form, and prepares him for Praxiteles as a swift and vigorous youth. He is the patron saint of athletes, and his shamelessly virile image has a place in every palastra. As herald, he is an entity of eloquence. As celestial interpreter, he is the first of a long hermeneutical line. One of the Homeric hymns tells us how, in his youth, he stretched strings across a tortoise shell. Well, be kind to the living ones, at least. And so invented the lyre. Finally, it comes his turn to appease Aphrodite and their offspring, we are told, is a delicate hermaphrodite, sharing their charms and named from their names. Hermaphrodite. It was characteristic of Greece that in addition to deities of chastity, virginity, and motherhood, it should have a goddess of beauty and love. Doubtless, in her Near Eastern origins, and in Cyprus, her half-oriental home, Aphrodite was first of all a mother goddess to the end of her tenure. She remained associated with reproduction and fertility in the whole realm of plant, animal, and human life. But as civilization developed, and increasing security obviated the need for a high birth rate, the aesthetic sense was left free to see other values in woman than those of multiplication, and to make Aphrodite not only the embodiment of the ideal of beauty, but in the deity of all heterosexual pleasure. The Greeks worshipped her in many forms as Aphrodite, Urania, the heavenly, the goddess of chaste, or sacred love, as Aphrodite, Pandemos, the popular, the goddess of profane love in all its modes, and even as Aphrodite, Callipagus, the Venus of the lovely Nates. The myth of Adonis is one more variation on the vegetation theme, the annual death and resurrection of the soil. This handsome youth was desired by both Aphrodite and Persephone, the goddess of love and of death. Ares, jealous of Adonis' success with Aphrodite, disguised himself as a wild boar and killed him. The Edamone was born of Adonis' blood, and rivers of poetry from Aphrodite's grief. Zeus persuaded the goddess to divide Adonis' time and attentions by leaving him for half a year with Persephone and Hades, and restoring him for half a year to earthly life and love. In Thessalonica, Cyprus, and Athens, the death of the boy was commemorated in the festival of the Adonia. Women carried images of the Lord, for such was the meaning of his name, loudly bewailed his death, and triumphantly celebrated his resurrection. Now remember that Aduni meant leader of the community in a very specific form, and to the Aramean-speaking people, biblical Hebrew, which was, most people will call it, it was really wider than just the Hebrews and stuff that used this. The term was used for more, it could have been used for an angel, it could have been used for a king. It was used for more than what was being worshipped. There's a lot of confusion in the biblical use of the word Lord sometimes, but To her, in competition with Hera and Athena, Paris awarded the golden apple as a prize of beauty. The golden apples is one of the key myths of, what might be called the gifts of the fairies in Celtic society, but they really don't say. The gifts of the fairies are the bag and the stone and the apples and the magical use of sticks and nuts or something like that. But perhaps she was never really beautiful until Praxiteles reconceived her and gave her the loveliness for which Greece could forgive all her sins. Ares, Hermes, Poseidon, Dionysus, and many immortal like Anchises and Adonis. Yeah, that's just a whole lot of them, right? But perhaps she could have been faithful to each of them in the turn, To the legitimate or illegitimate children of Zeus, we must add, as major Olympians, his sister Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and his unruly brother Poseidon. This Greek Neptune, secure in his watery realms, considered himself fully the equal of Zeus. Even landlocked nations worshipped him, for he commanded not only the sea, but the rivers and the springs. It was he who guided the mysterious subterranean streams and made earthquakes with tidal waves. To him Greek mariners prayed and raised appeasing temples on perilous promontories. Subordinate deities were numerous, even on Olympus, for there was no end to personifications. There was Hestia, the Roman Vesta, given one of the planetoids is named after it now, goddess of the hearth and its sacred fire. There was Eris, the rainbow, sometimes messenger for Zeus, Hebe, goddess of youth, Eileithyia, who helped women in childbirth, Dike, or justice, Take, or chance, and Eros, love, whom Hesiod made the creator of the world, whom Sappho called a limb-dissolving, bitter-sweet, impracticable wild beast. There was Hymenus, the marriage song, Hypnos, sleep, Oniros, dream, Garos, old age, Lethe, oblivion, Thanatos, death, and others beyond naming. Well, the focus isn't necessarily on naming them all, but realize that they wanted to connect the idea of everything to some sort of spiritual force or whatever. So just think of anything that's important and list it off accordingly. There were 9 muses to inspire artists and poets. Clio for history, Euterpe for lyric poetry, accompanied by the flute, Thalia for comic drama and idyllic poetry, Pelpomena for tragedy, Terpsichore for chorical dance and song, Arato for love verse and mimicry, Palamnia for hymns, Urania for astronomy, Calliope for epic poetry. There were 3 graces and their 12 attendants, the hours. There was Emesis, who meted out good and evil to men, and visited with disaster all who were guilty of hubris, insolence and prosperity, hubris as people call it. There were the terrible Erindaes, the Furies who left no wrong unrevenged, the Greeks, with depreciating euphemism, called them well-wishers, Eumenides, and finally, there were the Moirai, the Fates, or Allotters, who regulated inevitably the affairs of life and ruled, some said, both gods and men. In that conception, Greek religion found its limit and flowed over into science and law. We have left for the last, the most troublesome, the most popular, the most difficult to classify of all the Greek entities. Only late in his career was Dionysus received into Olympus, and Thraka, which gave him as a Greek gift to Greece. He was the god of liquor, brewed from barley, sometimes rye, right? And it was known as Sabazius. In Greece, he became a god of wine, the nourisher and guardian of the vine. He began as a goddess of fertility, became a god of intoxication, and ended as a son of God dying to save mankind. Many figures and legends were mingled to make his myths. The Greeks thought of him as Zagreus, the horned child born to Zeus by his daughter Persephone. He was the best beloved of his father and was seated beside him on the throne of heaven. When the jealous Hera incited the Titans to kill him, Zeus, to disguise him, changed him into a goat, then a bull. In this form, nevertheless, the Titans captured him, cut his body into pieces, and boiled them in a cauldron. Athena, like another Trelawney, if you know about that comment, saved the heart and carried it to Zeus. Zeus gave it to Semele, who impregnated with it, gave to the god of second birth under the name of Dionysus. And remember, the taking of the heart out of the victim, still beating and all that sort of stuff was related to solar myths and returning the soul, freeing it, so it could be mourned for or dressed or form union, but it was all in a solar context. Diodorus Siculus, as early as 50 BCE, interpreted this tale as a vegetation myth. Zagreus, the vine, is a child of Demeter, the earth, fertilized by Zeus, the rain. The vine, like the entity, is cut, pruned, to give it new life, and the juice of the grape is boiled to make wine. Each year, under nourishing rains, the vine is reborn. Herodotus found so many resemblances between the myths of Dionysus and Osiris that he identified the two gods in one of the first essays in comparative religion. Yeah, most religions say most of the same things as each other, Mourning for Dionysus' death and joyful celebration of his resurrection form the basis of a ritual extremely widespread among the Greeks. In springtime, when the vine was bursting into blossom, Greek women went up into the hills to meet the reborn God. For 2 days they drank without restraint, and like our less religious Bacchanalians, remember, a text about Bacchus written 4 centuries before the Gospel of John was basically the Gospel of John in 90-something% of its text, at least that earlier version. Just leave out Bacchus and write in Jesus and, well, different forms. Considered him witless, who would not lose his wits. They marched in wild procession, led by Maenads, or mad women, devoted to Dionysus. They listened tensely to their story. They knew so well of the suffering, death, and resurrection of their god. And as they drank and danced, they fell into a frenzy in which all bonds were loosed. The height and center of their ceremony was to seize upon a goat, a bull, sometimes a man, seeing in them incarnations of God, to tear the live victim to pieces in commemoration of Dionysus's dismemberment, and then to drink the blood and eat of the flesh in a sacred communion, whereby, as they thought, the god would enter them and possess their souls. In that divine enthusiasm, they were convinced that they and the god became one in a mystic and triumphant union. They took his name and called themselves after one of his titles, Bakkoi, and they knew that they would never die. From Antheos, a god within, enthusiasm originally meant possession by a god, and very often that was done through drugs, but we have over 50 opioids to do something with in our body, and we can achieve any drug high without that, and without even, sadomasochism and stuff too, but, or they termed their state an ecstasis, or going out of their souls to meet and be with Dionysus. Thus, they felt freed from the burden of the flesh. They acquired divine insight. They were able to prophesy. They were gods. Such was the passionate cult that came down from Thracia into Greece like a medieval epidemic of religion, dragging one region after another, from the cold and clear Olympians to the state worship, into a faith and ritual that satisfied the craving for excitement and release, the longing for enthusiasm and possession, mysticism and mystery. Remember, John Dee was actually trying to bring back some of the experience of the early church through the Enochian material, sharing it with one of the cardinals. They actually there was actually consideration, I don't think, consideration, like they were going to add new books to the Bible or make the Enochian stuff official, at least for controlled use of the church. But it was definitely out there. The priests of Delphi and the rulers of Athens tried to keep the cult at a distance, but failed. All they could do was to adopt Dionysus into Olympus, Hellenize and humanize him, give him an official festival, and turn the revelry of his worshippers from the mad ecstasy of wine among the hills into the stately processions, the robust songs, and the noble drama of the great Dionysia. For a while they won Dionysus over to Apollo, but in the end Apollo yielded to Dionysus, heir and conqueror, Christ. Well, we find that Christianity pretty much absorbed every other cult that could have possibly been attributed to it. And where it seems that it failed, they added in saints later on. There were literally over 10,000 saints in the Catholic Church, they say. Or maybe that was the whole Christianity, but the Orthodox had some saints that were unique to them, and the Catholic Church had a bunch, but the Catholic Church pretty much had the ones that would later become the Orthodox ones, because it was really Catholic before it was Orthodox in some of these areas, and the Catholics kind of spread, but they didn't have the authority that the Orthodox had, so the Orthodox did incorporate stuff that wasn't earlier incorporated.